Հայտնի կրիստալային համով ջուր պատմական աղբյուրից.
From London. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person. I'm hearing a little echo, but hopefully no, I think that has gone. And it's a great honor to be able to talk to the Assembly today, as you say, in this time of international turmoil, not least of which is the very sad situation in the South Caucasus. Let me begin with the September the 19th military assault by Azerbaijan on Nagorno-Karabakh, which resulted in several hundred deaths, almost all of them military ones, but civilians also suffered. This military operation marked what I would call the formal end of the Armenian majority region known as Nagorno or Nagorny or Mountainous Karabakh, which has existed with that name as a territorial entity since 1923, and for many preceding centuries with other names. This is a human tragedy for its people. As you know, almost the entire Armenian population, more than 100,000 people, probably 99% of the people who were there on September the 18th, fled to Armenia following the military operation. Obviously, this conflict is very old. I've written about it for many years. It's had many phases, many twists and turns. Over the decades, unfortunately, force, not diplomacy, has always determined outcomes, with both Armenians and Azerbaijanis making facts on the ground through military operations. Over the years, there were also many difficult questions to the Armenian side. Since 1988, both Armenians and Azerbaijanis have used what can be qualified as ethnic cleansing, using force or the threat of force to drive members of the other community from their homes. So this latest round of violence is also one more tragic blow to prospects for peace and reconciliation in the South Caucasus. Now, I want to make the point that it's all the more tragic in my view because it could have been avoided, as active diplomacy was also underway. Since December 2021, there has been a serious Western-mediated diplomatic process, moderated by EU Council President Charles Michel, which deserved more investment from all sides, and in particular from Azerbaijan. It ran in parallel to negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan run by Moscow. In recent weeks, a dialogue had finally begun between the Armenians of Karabakh and representatives from Baku. This is something that many of us have been calling for years, but for years, Azerbaijan had refused to talk to the Armenians of Karabakh in any other format apart from as kind of domestic constituents of Azerbaijan. This new dialogue had finally begun, even despite the fact that Azerbaijan imposed a de facto blockade and closure of the Lachin corridor linking Armenia and Karabakh, imposing for many months, as we know, severe humanitarian suffering on the population of Karabakh for almost the entirety of this year. Time and patience was needed for this new process between the Karabakh Armenians and Baku to develop. Everyone, including finally the Karabakh Armenians themselves, understood that the final settlement of this conflict would occur within the framework of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. The only question was on what terms. So, being the actor in the most dominant position, President Ilham Aliyev had choices, but he chose to use force on September the 19th. This was also a breach of faith to Western leaders and their process, and cut off the dialogue process with the Karabakh Armenians. Although only a small number of Armenian civilians suffered violence, the overwhelming threat of force was, I would contend, enough to ensure that almost the entire population felt unsafe, felt in threat of persecution, and left Karabakh and their homes. We know that this Azerbaijan's military action was coordinated with Turkey. Although we do not know the details, we can also be fairly sure that it was coordinated also with Russia. This is because Russian peacekeepers were ordered to stand down in Karabakh themselves. They allowed the Azerbaijani forces to proceed, while media outlets in Moscow were instructed to blame Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan rather than Azerbaijan for the outbreak of violence. Subsequently, at the United Nations, Moscow was much softer than Western countries in its characterization of this military operation by Azerbaijan. So this is the context within which Western engagement and engagement by bodies such as this with Armenia and Azerbaijan now takes place. In my view, it's time for a comprehensive reassessment from organizations such as this one. Azerbaijan is now proposing, and I'd like to devote a little time to this, is now proposing what it calls a reintegration agenda under which Armenians can return to Karabakh and be Azerbaijani citizens. Let me note that Azerbaijan does not have dual citizenship, so Karabakhis who return would have to renounce their Armenian citizenship. I think that international bodies such as the Council of Europe must be very cautious about an initiative such as this. After all, we must begin by asking why this is happening. This initiative is only being offered only when 99% of the Karabakh Armenian population has fled and not previously. I think this initiative needs to be seen within a broader framework of Azerbaijan's international commitments. And three broader issues, maybe more, but three broader issues need to be addressed. The first is Azerbaijan's record on minority populations in general. None of the minorities in Azerbaijan have any special political rights or autonomy provision. The languages of the two main minorities, the Talish and the Lezgin, are taught to just over 28,000 children in schools, according to Azerbaijan's own data from 2022. This is the main extent of their minority rights, and we're talking about substantial minority populations running into the hundreds of thousands. The opinion of the Advisory Committee of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities from 2017 noted a deteriorating human rights environment in Azerbaijan, pressure on minorities to demonstrate loyalty to the state, and, I quote, little space for expression of national minority identities in the public sphere, unquote. Several activists from minority communities, such as the Talish journalist Hilal Mamadov, are in prison. And so I would say that until Azerbaijani minorities in general have stronger legal protection and access to the rule of law, it is not feasible to imagine the integration of Armenians into Azerbaijani society. My second point is that, as many independent reports have confirmed, the Azerbaijani education system teaches children strongly negative and hate-provoking messages about Armenians as vandals, terrorists, and occupiers who committed genocide against Azerbaijan in the 1990s. I should also note in parenthesis that the Armenian education system does the same, though I would say without the same level of intensity. Without a wholesale reform of the national rhetoric about Armenians, as expressed through the education system, also the media and political discourse in general in Azerbaijan, I would say it's difficult to imagine Armenians feeling safe to live freely on Azerbaijani territory. Thirdly, any initiative such as this requires international scrutiny, and Azerbaijan's record on this is very poor. There have been many calls over the years to allow international fact-finding and monitoring missions to visit Nagorno-Karabakh. Prior to 2020, some of these were rejected by the Armenians of Karabakh. More consistently, and especially since 2020, these proposals for the UN or other organizations to visit have been rejected by Azerbaijan, meaning that Nagorno-Karabakh remained a deeply isolated region, with the International Committee of the Red Cross the only international body on the ground. As you know too well, this assembly also called for a fact-finding mission to Karabakh in June during the blockade, but the call was rejected by Azerbaijan. I also note the international requests by cultural institutions to visit the site of the famous medieval Armenian cemetery in Julfa Nakhchivan, which is widely reported to have been completely destroyed, have also been rejected. 2 US ambassadors to Baku who requested to visit the site of the cemetery were refused permission to do so. This also has implications for the fate of the substantial Armenian cultural heritage in Karabakh, which is now under full Azerbaijani control. I also have a few other comments. Just tell me how much time I have remaining.
You have about 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up.
Okay. Just briefly, let me, and we can return to this in the question and answer session. I would make the point that Azerbaijan also had a choice whether it wanted to see a strong Armenia, which was a partner country, which would be have a normalization with Turkey and be weaken its dependence on Russia, to strengthen regional cooperation in the South Caucasus, or a weaker Armenia, which had a closed border with Turkey, was more reliant on Russia, and was unstable. And I would contend that, unfortunately, Azerbaijan has opted for the second option, seems to be trying to weaken Armenia. This is, it's since the operation of September the 19th, it has kept up rhetoric about Azerbaijani exclaves inside Armenia as a territorial issue which needs peaceful resolution. It's kept up rhetoric about the so-called Zangezur corridor, a transport route to Nakhchivan. And most troubling, there's also rhetoric in Azerbaijan calling Armenia historic Azerbaijani territory, Western Azerbaijan, and demanding the right of return of Azerbaijanis who used to live in Armenia earlier in the 20th century. In my view, all these issues need a comprehensive approach. There are also many Armenians displaced from Azerbaijan in the last decades. The territorial issues need a very careful and long-term process, and the corridor needs an international dimension, whereas what we're hearing is more in the way of ultimatums from Azerbaijan or to Armenia. But this is obviously a complex subject. I'm sure I've left many issues and nuances out, but I'll stop there, and I'd be glad to answer any